Welcome to 5 Books for Catholics, where an expert selects and explains 5 outstanding books on some aspect of Catholic life, doctrine, or culture. St. Anselm of Canterbury was a Benedictine monk, abbot, writer, and between 1093 and 1109, Archbishop of Canterbury. He was born at Aosta in Upper Burgundy. In 1060, he entered the monastery of Bec in Normandy. He helped make it a leading institute of learning and was elected abbot after 18 years. Following the Norman conquest, Anselm was obliged to visit the estates in England that had been donated to the monastery of Bec, and was eventually made Archbishop of Canterbury. However, his episcopacy was not a peaceful one. He clashed with the crown over the investiture controversy and was exiled twice. However, Anselm is remembered today mainly for his writings, which pioneered and developed the nascent medieval scholasticism. Philosophers continue to ponder his Monologion's argument for God's existence. Theologians continue to discuss his explanation of the motives for Christ's incarnation and death on the cross. He was declared a doctor of the Church in 1720. In this episode, Montague Brown discusses 5 of St. Anselm's main works. Montague Brown is Professor of Philosophy at St. Anselm College. His main areas of interest are medieval philosophy, mainly Augustine, Anselm and Aquinas, metaphysics, ethics, philosophy of mind, and the relation between faith and reason. He is author of several books, including The Quest for Moral Foundations and Introduction to Ethics, published by Georgetown University Press, The 1-Minute Philosopher, published by Sophia Institute Press, and Reason, Revelation, and Metaphysics, The Transcendental Analogies, published by Catholic University of America Press. The books discussed in this episode are first, the Monologion by St. Anselm, second, the Proslogion by St. Anselm, third, Cur Deus Homo, Why Did God Become Man by St. Anselm, fourth, De Veritate, On Truth by St. Anselm, and fifth, De Concordia, The Compatibility of God's Foreknowledge, Predestination, and Grace with Human Freedom by St. Anselm. Links to these books are available in the show notes to this episode. And if you have a moment, please support this podcast by leaving a top rating on the platform of your choice. Professor Montague Brown, welcome.
Yes, good to be here.
First of all, let's discuss briefly St. Anselm's life and career. What is most striking about St. Anselm as a monk and a bishop?
Well, I think he's a very interesting person because he has all these features that while prior he wrote works for his monks, and then as abbot he continued to write, and even as archbishop in Canterbury, the second archbishop of Canterbury, he continued to write. So he's a very interesting figure because he's a good philosopher, a great theologian, and very much involved in the life of the monastery and then also the life of the church with all those headaches and difficulties with the kings of England that he had to deal with.
What is most striking about his work as a theologian?
Well, I think he contributes both. Well, he tries to give as much explanation as he can in many cases just through philosophy, as he claims in the Monologion. He's not going to talk about Christ himself, and in fact, he uses the word God only in the first chapter and the last chapter. Other than that, supreme essence. And he says he's doing the same thing in Cur Deus Homo. So that is an attempt to do it through reason rather than through the faith. But of course, the Proslogion is faith-seeking understanding, very much dedicated to the faith. When he writes those shorter works, including on free choice of the will and on the truth, he takes scripture from that. And then I think very nicely in Concordia, which is the reconciliation or the harmony between providence, predestination, grace, and freedom, then he's saying that in the end, all is grace, which I think is, that's compatible, I think, with what Augustine might have said in the end as well. But he wants to open up the world to the free creation that God gives to us, and not just based on metaphysical arguments, but based on the love of God and love of humanity.
Although St. Anselm distinguishes faith from reason, he probably would never have considered himself a philosopher in the modern sense of the term.
Right.
Nevertheless, he's widely studied by philosophers, both believers and non-believers. Is it appropriate or reductive to read him from a purely philosophical standpoint?
Well, I don't think so. And I think even if you read the Monologion, which is the one that expressly says will be just based on reason, once you get to chapter 29, or really I think around 40, when you get to talking about the Trinity as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, those are personal names, so I don't think you can really deal with that then just in terms of understanding, memory, and love, as Augustine did. So I think to read him just as a philosopher is too narrow, and he certainly has other interests.
Who were the main influences on St. Anselm's thought?
Well, I would say certainly St. Augustine. I think he's his most favorite thinker in terms of influence. And he says at the beginning of the Monologion that, by the way, if you think I say too much about the Trinity that can't be saved by reason, take a look at Augustine's Trinity. It is true, of course, that Augustine at the end of that book on the Trinity says, as much as we try to give answers that will work and all these as good examples from our life, nothing can really explain the Trinity. So in the end, I think that's Augustine's position. I think by the end of Anselm's life, it's very much his position too. And certainly Thomas Aquinas will say that there aren't philosophical reasons per se for the incarnation or the Trinity. So I think he's in that tradition. So certainly Augustine, I think, mainly. Boethius, to some degree. He has some language about eternity that harkens back to Boethius. But of course, Boethius on Consolation of Philosophy really is mostly a philosophical work, or at least it's philosophical theology, whereas Anselm goes certainly beyond that, very much so.
St. Anselm stands at the bridge between monastic theology from the Middle Ages and the nascent scholastic movement. Did he lay the groundwork for medieval scholasticism?
Yes, I think he did. There's certainly an element, and he recognizes his own work in the Monologion, the long, drawn-out arguments, and quite a lot of those in Cur Deus Homo as well, that, as you're reading them, you're able to follow along, but it's very hard to keep them all in mind. There's so many piled upon each other. But it's that analytic style trying to show that each point makes sense and then leads to another one. So I think, yes, he's of two minds in my mind, just maybe the way Augustine is as well. So Augustine has his work on free choice of the will and on the Trinity, which are kind of more the philosophical directive, sort of a little bit analytic even for that. But then he's got his Confessions, which is much more existential and phenomenological. And certainly Anselm in the Proslogion, particularly that opening prayer, and his prayers and meditations is very not so much scholastic, but just from the love of Christ in the existential position of how do I get back home. So he's really on the cusp of the two. And I don't think, I don't think he ever gives up that deep love, spiritual love of God that guides him in the Proslogion.
Are there any good monographs on St. Anselm's life or which give an overview of his thought?
Well, there certainly are. I think Kate Rogers has done a number of things on free choice of the will. Certainly the there, been biographies written on him too, which I haven't, followed that deeply. I'm more in the philosophical, theological element of him. But those are very helpful. And Eileen Sweeney also wrote a book on Anselm, very much dedicated to his, if you like, the deep love aspect of his work. So maybe Kate Rogers a bit more analytical, Eileen Sweeney more in terms of the love that drives Anselm.
And what drew you to study St. Anselm?
Well, lots of things. I mean, one thing, I did my dissertation on Thomas Aquinas, and I suppose a lot of my writing has been on Aquinas and Augustine. But coming to St. Anselm College was, first of all, I read Anselm in graduate school as well. But coming here, it seemed like an important element to add to my life. And then I was asked to be director of the Institute for St. Anselm Studies. And so I've written a number of pieces on Anselm. I've never written a whole book-length work on Anselm, but a bunch of several papers. And I just think he's a brilliant mind. And again, it's a combination of analytic and depth of I think love and commitment that you find in his work. And so he's very, as you read through, I think very clear in making his points. Hard sometimes to hold the whole argument together because it's strung out, which is why he wanted to find a simpler argument in the Proslogion.
Well, that brings us to the first book on your list, Anselm's Monologion. He opens with various arguments for God's existence, and from the results of those arguments proceeds to work out and justify the various divine attributes. What are Anselm's main contributions in this work?
Well, I think the opening two arguments are standard arguments, and they're kind of Platonic, I suppose, but they become standards for going forward. That is, if there are many different things that are good in the world, they share something in common, so there must be a transcendent good. And the second one, if things are more or less good, then there's got to be a standard of goodness to which they all refer. That second one very much what Thomas Aquinas picks up later. So I think that, and then following from that, what a free creation would be like, creation from nothing, as he says, that does not mean not from anything, and it doesn't mean from something that's called nothing. It means has no priority, so that it's a kind of a free creation, and therefore, if creation is the source of all truth, then it will end up being a kind of free truth, which he gets to more in De Veritate.
Anselm was not entirely satisfied, as you mentioned, with the Monologion, a sort of single argument from which he could work out and justify God's various attributes. What is the Proslogion's argument for God's existence, and does it work?
Well, he starts off with, in a way, faith, but I mean, people have taken it just as a first premise that he says, we believe that you are that than which nothing greater can be conceived. But if you start with the context of leaving the belief out for a second, which I think is not what Anselm's doing, but if you do that, then the second premise is it's greater to believe, to exist in reality and the mind than just the mind. Therefore, God exists in reality. So I think that's, as a logical argument, is very strong in lots of ways. Thomas Aquinas disagrees with it because he thinks it's got four terms in it, because you're starting with the idea of God, and therefore you can only conclude with the idea of God, as opposed to starting with experience of the world and then going to the existence of a really existing God. So that's the main argument. Now, of course, Anselm will justify his argument in reply to Gonolo in a way that I think probably would satisfy Thomas Aquinas, but we can talk about that if you want to. But that's the basic argument, and it's based on the same insight as those from the Monologion. It's based on the idea of good, and our search for the good means that if we can recognize that there's something missing in our account, then we haven't gotten to God. God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. So if we can recognize that we don't have all the truth, or that we're not perfectly happy, then there's always more to call us forth toward trying to understand God.
As you mentioned, Anselm's contemporary Gonolo of Marmoutier wrote a critique of the proselygon's argument for the existence of God. The gist of his objection is that we can think of the most perfect kind of island, but that does not necessitate the existence of such an island. Similarly, the concept of that which no greater thing can be conceived does not necessarily entail the actual existence of God. Does Gonolo succeed in debunking the argument of the proslogion?
Well, I think in the end he doesn't, or at least Anselm has a good reply to him. So for on the island example, Anselm's going to say that the argument he's making only works for that than which nothing greater can be conceived, only works for God. So you can talk about the best island, but an island doesn't have all perfections. It just has the perfections of an island. So the only being that would have all perfections, or you shouldn't take any away from them, would be God, the transcendent source of all things. So he understands that this argument that he makes only works for God, can't work for any other kind of perfection. And then on the other one, where Gonolo says, well, I can't really come to a conception of that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Anselm argues, and here I think he goes back really to the foundations in his monologion, that yes, from experience of the things in the world is more or less good, you can get something of this idea. So having said that, and I don't know whether Thomas didn't know that reply or whatever, but that seems to be hearkening back to something that Aquinas would agree to. You're starting with existing things, therefore you can argue to really existing things, not starting with a mere idea.
Subsequently, Anselm's argument in the Proslogion was called the ontological argument. Is that an appropriate name for his argument?
I don't think so, because it's not meant to be an a priori argument, I don't think. And given, again, the two things. One, it's not just a philosophical argument. Anselm starts off, we believe, so he's committed in the faith. But secondly, the argument itself is really an argument toward the good and the greatest good, not just a logical conviction that something abstract exists, but that our whole lives are dedicated toward reaching out toward that which is most perfect. We know we don't have it because we know we're unhappy. If you know you're unhappy, you know something about happiness, so it's an ongoing search rather than a convenient summary of the existence of God as abstract, which is, I think, more what certainly Descartes was doing in his argument.
One of the intended adversaries of Anselm's argument for God's existence is the person described in Psalm 14, verse 1. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. We tend to imagine that there were not many actual atheists in Anselm's day. Are Anselm's arguments meant to shake people out of indifference and practical atheism, or to confirm believers in their faith?
I think certainly in the Proslogion, he's going to say, confirm people in our faith. But I think the effort he makes both in the Monologion and Cur Deus Homo to give arguments based on reason is based somewhat on a desire for ecumenism, to be able to reach out to people that don't believe and to show them that it's reasonable to believe. As he shows in Cur Deus Homo in the beginning, the non-believers think that it's irrational and unfitting for God to have to suffer, and Anselm wants to turn that around and say, no, here are the reasons why this is the only way we can be saved, the only way we can get to happiness, which we all desire, even the pagans. So I think, yes, it's for confirming his monks in the faith and helping them understand more deeply, but I think it's also there to reach out to people who do have these objections, philosophical, and they can be removed.
Thank you for listening. To read or listen to the rest of this interview and gain full access to our archive, visit 5booksforcatholics.com and become a premium subscriber. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and give it a top rating on the platform of your choice. That way, more people can discover it. You can also support the podcast and help us produce more interviews like this one by making a one-off donation via the link given in the show notes. As little as $1, £1, or €1 can help and will be greatly appreciated. Thank you once again, and God bless.